Jeffery Olsen is the author of Knowing. He joins us to tell us the story of his car accident, the loss of his wife and son, and the subsequent near-death experience. He talks about grieving, finding oneness, and a new level of trust in life. Enjoy. Welcome to the Illuminate Recovery Podcast. We shed light on mental health issues, mental illness, and addiction recovery. Ways to cope, manage, and inspire. Beyond the self-care we will discuss, you may need the help of a licensed professional. My name's Kurt Nider. I'm a husband, a father, entrepreneur, a handyman, and a student of life. I avoid conflict, I deflect with humor, and I'm fascinated by the human experience.
And I'm Shelley Mangum. I am a clinical mental health counselor, and my favorite role of all times is grandma. I am a seeker of truth, and I feel like life should be approached with tremendous curiosity.
I ask the dumb questions.
I fill in the gaps.
The Illuminate Recovery Podcast is brought to you by Illuminate Billing Advocates. Make billing and collection simple with leader in substance abuse and mental health billing services. Verification and analysis of benefits, pre-authorizations, utilization management, accurate claim submission and management, denial and appeal management, and industry-leading reporting. Improve your practice's cash flow and your ability to help your clients with Illuminate Billing Advocates.
This morning is our great pleasure to have Jeffery Olsen with us. Jeff is a conceptual thinker, visionary leader, and brand strategist with over 20 years of experience. He's a persuasive leader with the ability to unify integrated teams on multiple complex problems or projects and problems. He's the board of directors of the International Association of Near-Death Studies. He's a creative director at BYU Broadcasting and the author of Knowing, Memoirs of a Journey Beyond the Veil and Choosing Joy After Tragic Loss. Jeff, couldn't be more excited to be with you this morning and have the opportunity to kind of hear your story and pick your brain a little bit.
Oh, thank you. You make me sound so important.
Then I've done my job well, right?
That's right.
Oh, it's always funny when people read my bio, I'm like, wow, you made that sound really good. Who are you talking to? Because I need to spend time with them.
Yeah.
That's fantastic. Well, Jeff, I know you've done a lot in advertising, even before you wrote your book, and that was kind of where you've had your career and you're super talented in that. But the experience that you had, early in your marriage and in your life is probably what makes you some of the person that you are today. So maybe you can share just some of that story with our listeners to bring them up to speed.
Oh, I would love to. I mean, it is interesting. I often say, yes, marketing, creative direction, that's what I do. That's my job. But it's not necessarily my calling. It's not my ministry. And that ministry, the catalyst of which was a near-death or out-of-body experience, which was the result of a horrible automobile accident. And it's been 24 years since the accident happened. But it was a family vacation, a family road trip. It was myself, my wife, and our two young boys. And it was a single car rollover. And that's the difficult part of the story is there was reports of crosswinds. There was reports of a pickup truck that was driving erratically on the interstate. The most difficult thing is I believe I may have just dozed off at the wheel, just nodded off. But what happened is I swerved to the right, I overcorrected to the left, and I lost control of the car. And the car began to roll with the cruise control, which was set at 75 miles an hour. So high speed rollover. The car rolled down the road, not off the road. And the accident reports say the car probably rolled 6 to 8 times. Now, I blacked out for most of that. But when the car came to a stop, I was very conscious. And the first thing I heard was my 7-year-old Spencer, my oldest son at the time, crying in the back seat. And he was hysterical, but it was one of those cries where I thought, he's okay. I got to get to my boy. I've got to get to my son. But that's when I realized that I couldn't move. I was pinned either to the floorboard or the seat. There was the rancid smell of gasoline, the broken glass. I was struggling to breathe. I was in intense pain, and I was holding on to consciousness. I was not aware of my injuries, but what had actually happened is that both of my legs had been crushed and shattered. My left leg was actually eventually amputated above the knee a few days later. My back had been broken. My rib cage was damaged. My lungs were collapsing. My right arm had been completely torn out of socket, all the rotator cuff muscles and everything detached. And then the seat belt had cut through me and ruptured all my insides. I was in rough shape, but I knew my boy was crying and wanted to get to him. However, that's when the brutal reality hit that no one else was crying. And that's when I became acutely aware that my wife and my youngest son had been killed instantly in the accident. Now that's the darkest place a man could ever be, you know. I mean, half the family's gone. I've got a hysterical 7-year-old I can't get to. I'm losing consciousness and in intense trauma. So that was the darkest place, you know, I could ever be in. And yet it was in that darkest place. And I don't share that to be morbid or graphic. It was in that darkest place that this out-of-body or near-death experience unfolded. I mean, as I was in that hysteria of how, you know, what just happened, and I get those 2 seconds back, I felt like light came to me. Like light literally came and surrounded me, almost like a blanket, like a tangible light. And I began to rise above the accident scene. And suddenly I could breathe. I was okay. The pain was no longer there. And I was actually somewhat confused, thinking, what's happening? How could I possibly be okay? How could I possibly be okay given what just happened? And yet in that light, my wife, Tamara, who I knew was deceased at the scene, there she was. And she was alive and beautiful and glorious. And she was communicating with me, actually saying, Jeff, you can't come. You've got to go back. You've got to go back. And we had a conversation about, you know, I couldn't come. We had a little boy in the backseat of that car who was going to be okay. And if I went with her, he'd be orphaned. And I learned a lot about choice. I was looking at the woman I loved more than life, and yet I knew I had a little boy in the backseat of that car, and I made a decision. I made a choice to come back.
Could you have stayed?
I don't know. You know, now, I mean, the conversation was so poignant. You know, I mean, when a man's got the woman he loves saying, go, you've got to go, you can't come. I didn't fight that. I mean, it almost felt like my soul knew I had to come back. But what if I'd have said, nope, I'm staying with you, my dear, and we're going to move forward together? I don't know. That was not the choice I made. But it felt like it was my choice. And yet everything in the universe was saying, you got to go back. You got to go back.
That's a tough position to be in, for sure.
It is. And the interesting thing about coming back, I mean, this is, you know, I didn't have to figure out, you know, how to do that. I mean, we have no idea how powerful our thoughts are. You know, I said the most profound goodbye I'll ever say. And then as I made that choice, I literally found myself wandering, moving about a hospital. Now, you know, I have no concept of time in this bubble of light. I later found out that people arrived at the scene of the accident. My 7-year-old Spencer was banged up a bit, but was okay. Fortunately, a doctor stopped and knew how to take care of the accident scene and the bodies of my wife and my little youngest boy, Griffin. I had to be extricated from the car, and because of my injuries, I was airlifted and life flighted to the nearest level 1 trauma center. I knew nothing of that. I knew I'd crashed the car. I knew we'd lost half the family. I said the most profound goodbye I'll ever say, and then I made the choice to come back and was moving about the hospital, encountering the doctors and nurses and the patients and the families of the patients. But when I say encountering them, I was seeing them so differently. I knew them. Everyone I saw, I knew their love, their hate, their joy, their motivations, their challenges. I knew them as if they were me. Like I felt their lives, and there was this connection. I now call it the oneness. Like I was them and they were me. And I grew up in a conservative Christian home, and the biblical verse, inasmuch as you have done it unto the least of one of these, you've done it unto me, which I used to think was something Jesus said about being nice to each other. But in this oneness, in this connection, I realized, oh, wow, what the master was talking about is I am the man in prison. I am the naked beggar on the street. They're me and I am them, and we are connected. We are one. And so there was this profound sense of love, of feeling, of knowing, until I came upon a body I didn't feel anything from, a man laying on the gurney, and I thought that was strange, and I stepped forward to look, and that's when I realized, oh my goodness, that's me. But it wasn't me. I was having this profound connected experience, but there was my body, the skin suit that I knew I would have to get back into. And once again, I didn't have to figure out how. As soon as I made that intention, that choice, I'm going back in, boom, then I was back into the body, but back to the trauma, the pain, the guilt, the grief, all of it. And, it was horrible. I was ventilated. They had a big tube down my throat doing the breathing through my lungs. My legs were obviously immobile. My right arm was immobile. They eventually tied down my left hand because I kept grabbing at all the, hospital equipment, all the, IVs and ventilator. And anyway, it was heavy coming back into the body, back to all the emotion, back to all the grief. And I learned a whole new meaning to be still. I mean, I just had to lay there in ICU, in and out of consciousness. I mean, the interesting thing is the door never really closed. There was still that veil was wide open. But I was in the hospital for 5 months. I had 18 surgeries in total, trying to put me back together. And there was all kinds of horrible infections. And I was throwing, pulmonary emboli, or the blood clots that lodge in your lungs. And I really shouldn't be here, but the motivator was I had made the choice to come back and raise my oldest son, and that was the catalyst for committing to getting well and getting through it.
That's incredible. I'm trying to envision what that must have been like for you, and to think that it's interesting, that idea that veil just kind of remained open for you, if that's the way you kind of described it. But it's interesting as you're in that near, out of body experience, that the grief, the pain is understandably leaving, but the grief and the shame and all of those pieces did not seem to be with you during that time. I think that's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, they certainly returned when I entered back in the body. But when I say that veil was wide open, I mean, my wife, Tamara, continued to communicate with me and to be very near. And I could feel the souls of the nurses that came in, or the doctors that paid visit. In fact, it's an interesting scenario. In that trauma center, one of the nurses and one of the attending physicians, Dr. Jeff O'Driscoll, had a profound experience, and they didn't know me from Adam. I was just a patient that had been airlifted in. But as they went into the operating room, when all the surgeons were working on my body and attempting to save my life, Dr. O'Driscoll saw, as did the nurse see, my wife Tamara's spirit in that operating room. And They later shared this with me, which is another miracle. I don't know what inspired them to come into my room after I had recovered and was well enough to speak with them, to share their experience. But the point being that, yeah, the veil was wide open for me, but it seemed to have been wide open for others, particularly this nurse and this doctor who had a profound experience at the same time I was having my experience. Dr. O'Driscoll says, while you were saying goodbye to Tamara, I was meeting her and saying hello because she was right there with you. And he said she communicated with him. I said, what did she say? And he said, she simply shared her gratitude for what we were doing to save your life. And I thought, well, of course she did. That's exactly what she would do. And I knew he was telling me the truth because that was her personality. That's what she would have done.
Well, and it's interesting that you share that perspective because, I've heard, in the near-death experience world that, some people will pass that off and just say, look, that's just because your body's in trauma. It's something that the mind creates. It's easy to say that that's what happens, but when somebody else sees the same thing as you and they're not in that traumatic experience, that becomes a little bit harder to displace or put aside.
Yeah. I've heard all the theories of, oh, hey, your brain, the oxygen was shutting off, but yeah, you had two very healthy people that weren't in physical trauma whatsoever, and actually clinical staff, which, I don't know, you put an MD after your name and there's some credibility there. Anyway, they had a profound experience as well. But these are the type of things that went on. My most profound experience may have been at the end of my hospital stay.
What was that?
Well, it's interesting. And it may be worth pointing out that the two most profound things that happened were at the scene of the accident, before I'd been administered morphine and, all the narcotics that I was given in the hospital. And then at the end of my hospital stay, when I was off of all that and was simply taking some Tylenol for pain, But as I went to sleep one night, and when I say went to sleep, I mean that the hospital was traumatic. I had laid on my back so long, I'd rubbed all the hair off the back of my head. The wounds in my belly and abdomen had to be left open because of infection. And yet at this point, they'd finally stabilized my abdomen. I was able to roll on my side. And I recall falling into a deep sleep and realizing, wow, I'm sleeping. I'm peacefully sleeping. And as I did, I felt that light come again. The same light like at the scene of the accident, this blanket of tangible light that surrounded me. And as I was in such grief too, and it seemed to lift me up out of the hospital bed. But this time the light dispensed, and I was in the most beautiful place. I mean, the most, I've heard people say heaven, the spirit world, the other side. The only word that comes close to what I experienced is I was home. I was home. It was so welcoming. It was so beautiful. And I was giddy. I was laughing. I was like, wow. In fact, I began to run. In this life with all the injuries, I don't walk well, let alone run. But I began to run, and I can't emphasize how physical it was. How sensory. I mean, I could feel the love and energy of the ground beneath my feet. I could feel the intelligence in my calves and thighs as I ran. I mean, it was a very, very sensual, physical experience. And as I was doing all that, I got the message or the knowing that I wasn't there to stay, that it was just a visit. And there was this corridor off to my left, and I knew intuitively I'm to go that way. And so I went down this corridor. But as I arrived at the end of the corridor, there was a crib. Now, Griffin, my little son that was killed in the accident, he was only 14 months old. So he had been sleeping in a crib at that point in his life. And so I raced and looked into the crib, and there he was. There was my boy, as beautiful as ever, sleeping peacefully. And again, the physicality of it was strange. I picked him up. I don't know if you've ever picked up a sleeping child, but there's a weight and a heat to them. I could feel him. He was solid against my body. And I could feel his breath on my neck. I could feel him breathing. I even asked, how can this be? But as soon as I had a question, it's like, I said, how can this be? And the answer came to me that all spirit is matter. It's more refined. And I was experiencing this heightened vibration of physicality. And I even leaned over and smelled his hair. You know, it was him. I mean, there's a smell of a child. I'm like, this is my boy. I began to weep because there I was holding my son. And as I held him, I felt an intense presence coming up behind me. Overwhelming, you know, powerful, cosmic, wise. And I began to be fearful because what I was feeling is I'm like, wow, that's God. And the guilt, you know, I thought my little boy passed because I crashed the car. His life was cut short because I lost control, and he's here because of me and my mistake. And anyway, and this presence was coming closer and closer, and I had the thought, I hope there's some way I can be forgiven. That was the thought as I held this beautiful child. And as soon as I had that thought, and this felt physical too, I felt these divine arms wrap around and hug both of us, just hold me and my son. And that's when the lid came off. It was just like, wow. The first thing that was communicated was there's nothing to forgive. Everything is in perfect divine order. And I thought, well, how? You know, and then I began to see my life. I suppose they call this the life review, but I was seeing my life, and I began to justify, oh, no, that was a mistake. I didn't mean to do that. And there was so much love, so much unconditional love. It was communicated there are no mistakes. Those are your choices. You're simply here to learn. And there was things I thought, yeah, but that was wrong, and I knew it was wrong, and I did it anyway. And this divine creator said, that's your judgment of it, not ours. We love you. We love you. I mean, what was communicated, and it was magnified in such an intense way, because here I am holding my perfect, precious, beloved little son. And what was communicated to me is you are as divine, as precious and beloved as the child you hold. To us. And it was a very personal experience, but I realized, wow, that's all of us. That's humanity. That's humankind, is that beloved, that divine, that perfect, if you will. And it was anyway, it was a profound, intense download of just truth and love and light. And again, I was taught about choice. I've come to the conclusion at this point in my life, there's only one cosmic rule, and that's free will and choice. We get to choose. But I was told I could choose to be angry at God my whole life because half the family passed and I'd be crippled. Or I could be mad at myself because I crashed the car and live in guilt and beat myself up the rest of my days. But I was told by this beloved creator, you can exercise your will. You can exercise your will in this matter. And I thought, but how? And my upbringing, I'm like, but it's your will be done. How, you know? And this is what was communicated, which was so profound. God whispered to me and said, your will is my will. That's how much we love you. And I'm like, wow. And he said, you can give your child to me. You can hand him over in trust and in love, and therefore exercise your will in giving him, so you don't feel like he was plucked away and taken from you. And in all that love and peace and beauty, I kissed my little boy and I handed him over. And then I came back, you know, to this realm, to the amputation and the wheelchair and all that went with it. But I had a little different insight. And you know, I grieved as miserably as anybody grieves. I don't want anyone to think that I had this accident and I had these profound things happen and I was okay. No, the accident happened. There was incredible experiences, and I grieved as miserably as anybody would. But there was these insights. There was these beautiful things, which probably are what brought me through. Otherwise, I might be the guy strung out on some street corner somewhere wondering what happened, you know.
Well, it's a huge contrast because if I'm not mistaken, there were times where you just wanted to die. I mean, you wanted to leave this world more than anything else. It was so painful and so dark, and yet you've got these profound experiences that shed light, but that didn't stop. That did not stop you from wanting to leave the pain and the just emotional, physical pain that you were in.
Yeah. Yeah. There was a point in the hospital that I actually was begging my brother, and this may have been the morphine, but I was begging him to sneak a gun into the hospital room and just leave it there. And I, with my one good left arm operating, I was going to end it. And I, I have no judgment of that either, because I would have done it. I mean, it was that dark. It was that miserable. And, of course, my brother wasn't going to do that. In fact, it's interesting that was, I believe that night is when they amputated my leg.
Mm.
And here I was begging to end my life, and my brothers went and signed the release, because I was on morphine and unable to sign my own release, but they signed the medical release to have the amputation done. So while I was begging them to end my life, they were taking the steps to literally save it, which that's love, that's honor.
But what a tough decision. And knowing that you're in such grief and in such depression, and what a hard thing for them. What great brothers. I mean, it's so fantastic to have family around us, for sure.
Yeah. I mean, I learned that. Even in this life review I spoke of, I saw my brothers and what a key role they played in my life, and I mean, it's beautiful. I was so fearful of God, and I had believed that life was a test and I was probably failing. And yet in those loving, unconditionally loving arms, life became a gift, not a test. It was an absolute gift. It was an absolute beautiful thing that I felt that I had created, and that the entire universe supported my experience here, as small and insignificant that might be, that there was so much love, that it was like, this is what your soul created for you and for your own soul's expansion, and we love you enough to support you through it. That was the essence.
It's really hard to wrap our heads around it. And here you've had this experience and still struggle to capture. What do you do with that right now in the flesh, as you're living your life, years later? What does that experience, those experiences that you've had, how does that impact the way you live your life now versus before the accident?
Well, I still have my bad days. I mean, I'm not, I haven't figured this all out. I'm continually learning. But when I do have challenges, instead of asking why, why me, why this, why now, I tend to shift to what am I learning from this? What is the pain teaching me? What is the grief teaching me? What is this challenge teaching me? And how's it stretching my soul? And if I can then honor it and be grateful for the lesson or for the experience, rather than being miserable and being a victim about it, it seems to rise the vibration. It seems to buoy me up and support me, so I can say, okay, this is one of those lessons that I created for myself. There's nowhere to point the fingers, so I can either thrash and sink, or I can gracefully walk through it and trust. I mean, that's the crazy thing. I mean, many of my beliefs were kind of turned inside out and expanded in ways where faith and hope and these words that are very meaningful to me have literally been transformed into trust. Doesn't matter what I believe anymore. I trust that everything is in divine order, and it's all for my soul's expansion and growth, and for my remembering that divine part within me and within everyone else, that we're here simply to learn, and it's all in unconditional love.
Do you still feel that same connection with people and can feel their energy?
Sometimes, yes. I mean, I still get mad at the guy that cuts me off and then I think, well, there's no reason to get angry. Or I'll say, what a blessing to feel angry. Wow, I'm alive, I'm gonna fly a few choice words out the window. And what a gift to be alive. I mean, but it's not an anger, resentful. It's a joyful gratitude. I do have experiences. I mean, I'll share it. I was working, and I should I mean, gosh, I did come out of the hospital. I was able to be fit with a prosthetic limb. I learned to walk again. And I was in a wheelchair for a while. I had a colostomy. I mean, there was all these things to overcome, but life went on. I healed. Spencer, my little son, was my hero. He was my support. He was my motivation. And I eventually fell in love again and remarried, and we adopted 2 boys, and I was rebuilding this family. And this was years after the accident. I had remarried, we had rebuilt. I was back working, and I went back to work in the wheelchair. I wanted to get back to work as soon as I could, as a release, as an escape, But on this particular day, my current wife, Tanya, was waiting for me. I'd taken the bus into work, and she was parked out on the curb, and I came out of our office building in Salt Lake City, and there was a homeless guy, and he came up to me, and he's like, "Hey, he was telling me his story. He needed money." And I was like, "Yeah, I got to go. My wife's right here." And then something just clicked and said, look at him. And so I just looked in his eyes, and suddenly he became my brothers, He became me. I thought, wow, if I had not had that support, I would be him. And here we are. And I don't know what came over me, but I literally just threw my arms around him and hugged him. And it came out of my mouth without even thinking about what I was saying. I almost heard myself say, "I know who you are." And then he burst into tears, and he was hugging me, and he said to me, "I know you know." And we sat there and hugged each other and cried. I'm sure Tanya was thinking, what are you doing? And at that point, I'd have given him everything out of my wallet, and suddenly he didn't need money anymore. He simply wanted to be acknowledged. There was this divine connection where we saw each other and honored each other. And that was the gift, So there are situations in everyday life where that veil does lift. And I'm like, wow. And I realized, maybe he came looking for something from me, and yet he was the one that gave the gift. He's the one that gave me the richness of spirit, because I thought, what a divine being. And if I can recognize that in everyone, I mean, that's the thing, It's like, hey, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. We're all divine manifestations of that. And if we can recognize that in each other, that's when that veil lifts and brings true oneness and connection.
Well, I love the way you generalize that to make it part of what connection for all of us, right? That's not unique to you. That's everybody that needs that connection. I mean, we talk about it on this podcast all the time, that the opposite of addiction is connection. Healing is all about that connection and that love. And if you want somebody to change, you have to love them and hold a space for that, right? And accept them right where they're at. So I love what you're sharing, because it supports the ideas that we talk about all the time on here.
Yeah. I do a lot of fun things. I work with a fellow named Hugh Vale, who does Mustang medicine. He works with wild Mustang horses. And he said something to me one day. He said, Jeff, the most important thing with these horses is they just have to feel safe. And he said, if they feel safe, they can flourish. And I thought, wow, isn't that true of all of us? If we just feel safe, like we're in a safe place to be us and to work through whatever we're working through, we can flourish and learn. And anyway, yeah, I love that. And it is a connection. And like I say, but for the grace of God, there go I. I mean,
That's one of my favorites too. I remind myself all the time of, look, the blessings you have are not yours. Like, they're gifts, and you better be appreciative of them and figure out how you're going to help other people, or they might get taken away, and then you'll be just the same as those people you look at and might, feel bad for.
Yeah. I mean, but Dr. Jeff O'Driscoll and I have become friends. I mean, after he shared the experience, and I said, wow, you have no idea what happened to me. That was my first safe place to feel safe and say, okay, you're a doc. If I'm nuts, you can send me to the psych ward and get me the treatment I need. But he was very cordial and open. And he said to me recently, he said, every spiritual experience we have is to serve others. And I'm like, wow, I thought it was for my own personal growth. And he's like, no, that's the benefit. But the experience is so you can reach out. And I have such a soft spot for addiction. Our youngest boy, we adopted 2 boys, and my baby's now 20, but he's been through addiction and recovery, and he's now doing really, really well. He's doing really, really well, and he's got a job and a girlfriend, and he is happy. But yeah, it was his journey. It was his path. I see that now. And my job as his father was to love him and give him a safe place to work through it. Right.
That's a really tough thing as a parent, to be able to sit back and go, they get choices, our children, especially our children, right? Because we want to tell them what to do. Like, if you'll just do what I tell you, you'll be fine. And just do it the way I tell you, and don't stress me out, right? And when we can sit back and go, look, they've got to do this journey on their own, and I got to just be here and hold a space and love them. It takes a lot of stress off of us as parents, but it's a really difficult shift to make. And I think you talk about that in your book of, kind of how you did that with your oldest child.
Yeah, my oldest son. I mean, everybody has their own journey. And yet, from my perspective, I that's what the universe does. Hey, they're in that realm. Let them have their experience. Let them make their choices. Let them learn for themselves, and we'll hold the space. We'll hold the context in love that they will learn. And we all learn in different ways. I mean, in other words, you don't have to have a near-death experience. You don't have to lose a leg and lose half your family and lose your mind, to connect to that divine. I mean, it could happen sitting in the front room on any given Tuesday. That's the beauty of the experience. We all have our own path. We all have our own way to go. I know scores of people who have been enlightened through their addiction. I mean, that was the catalyst that opened them up and said, wow, and I'm not promoting addictive behavior, but I'm just saying everything is love. Everything is light. And when I was in those divine arms, I realized our life is a gift, no matter what that looks like. And somebody's path might be completely different than mine, but that's perfect for them. And we can honor their path and love them. And that's where the healing comes. Love is the most powerful force in the universe. And love heals. It's the greatest healer is love.
Oh, it does. It's so true. And just try and tell those kids what to do. And they'll show you right away that you don't have that permission to do that, right?
No.
They will go, I'll show you. And then you end up pushing them away. So I love that concept. And there isn't anything, I agree with you, nothing more powerful than love to heal somebody, even ourselves, right? It's love, right? It just allows for all imperfection and all of that messiness of being human.
Oh, yeah. I mean, self-love is the key. I mean, when I came back from the experience, having been raised in a conservative Christian home, I would read things and they were completely different, like biblical things, I read where Jesus said, love your neighbor as yourself. I had skipped that whole self part. I was working so hard to love the neighbor, and then I realized, wow, if I don't love myself, then no wonder I don't love the neighbor, because I have to love the neighbor the same way I love myself. And that became very key in my healing. In fact, I didn't heal until I could forgive myself, love myself, and be at peace with all that had gone on.
That's got to be a tough journey, because as you tell the story, it sounds like you don't have a lot of memory of what was going on just before the accident. You don't know if it was, a gust of wind, a bad driver that you were avoiding. You can't remember any of those pieces, if I'm not mistaken. And so it leaves you kind of out there just wondering what really did happen.
Yeah, and I remember enough. I mean, the odd thing is I remember looking in the rearview mirror, probably about an hour before the accident. And it was just a moment, it was just a glance, but in just checking for traffic. And isn't it funny what a moment can hold? Like our lives is they're like a string of pearls, a string of moments. But I glanced in the rearview mirror and I saw Griffin, my little toddler son that passed in the accident, but he was sound asleep in his car seat. And I just felt this overwhelming connection. I noticed details like how long his eyelashes were. And I heard Spencer, my little 7-year-old, playing in the back seat. He had action figures and all the joyful noise of a little boy. And then I looked over at Tamara, my wife, and she was still holding my hand. She had reclined her seat back and she was sound asleep. But she's still holding onto my hand, like the same way she did when, I went on the first date with her in college and had a couple extra bucks and took her to a dollar movie. I mean, and there was this intense moment of gratitude. And I do remember it being a windy day. I recall that. I don't recall the truck, but I do recall perhaps dozing off. I mean, I remember that part of it, and that's, that, and yet, the knots that has tied in my mind, when I finally had to just let go and say, well, if everything's in divine order, and that's, and it is, I mean, little picture in time. I mean, I grieved so miserably, and I was raising Spencer and Tanya, my current wife. I wasn't dating. I wasn't looking for anyone. I was still heartbroken, But as that unfolded, and I met her through a work meeting. It wasn't, it was not a romantic thing. She showed up, but there was guidance and all that. She was moving away to Arizona, and we were long distance pen pals, if you will, writing emails and talking on the phone. But I began to realize that I was falling in love with her, that I was having romantic feelings for this woman. And it made me, I went to my first wife's grave, and I was angry. I mean, I was bawling and kneeling down on the lawn there where her, headstone was. And I was saying, how dare you? How dare you leave me? I mean, I'm here limping around trying to raise our son, and you're in that beautiful place. And yet, I was doing that, but I swear she came to me. I mean, I don't see her with my physical eyes, but I felt her behind me, and I felt her hands on my shoulders. And she said, don't berate me. I loved you enough to go. And I thought, what? And she said, don't you remember? I mean, it was like a soul contract. She said, we had a deal. Your soul wanted this, and I would have loved nothing more than to stay and grow old with you, but I loved you enough to leave, that you would have the experience you came to have. And I'm here. I'm watching over you. And of course, I was still in a fighting mood and said, well, but I'm having feelings for another woman. And she laughed at me. She said, of course you are. I know who you are. I know how you are. She's like, please, who do you think brought her in your path? She's like, I'm orchestrating that. And she begged me to please choose joy. She said, we're still connected, and I can only be as happy as you are. And wow, I hurt because you hurt so bad. And here's all this opportunity laid at your feet. Please choose joy. You're a pretty good dad, but you're a lousy mother. And our little boy could use your mom. And you could use some joy in your life. You could use connection. You could use a partner. And that sounds so bizarre and profound, but I literally had a visitation where, and she said, Tanya's the one I sent in your way. She's awesome. You might not know that yet, but she's the one that will teach you unconditional love. And as things unfolded, that unconditional love was to love myself. And so there's, I don't know if the door ever shut for me, even in the healing and, the things that go on. There's these, I have two incredible guardian angels in my wife that passed and in my son who passed, Griffin, the little boy I held as a toddler. And I think that was the kindness of the universe. I'm not pretending that he's a toddler up in some other realm, because he's come to me more recently in dreams as a grown young man. But in that instance, the universe knew I needed to hold my little boy. Mm-hmm. And that was provided. And yet he's come to me more recently as a guardian angel, big, tall, strong young man who's got my back no matter what.
That's profound. And that idea that you choosing joy or sadness or anger is also affecting your first wife, and that connection. It's interesting that way you put that, right? That connection between people is that our choices affect other people because we're connected to them. That's pretty profound too. Does that give you think about that as you go through the choices you make and how connected you are to others, or that knowing of how connected you are?
Oh, yeah. In fact, even our thoughts affect
Mm.
each other and affect ourselves. I mean, we have no idea how powerful we are as individual. I was going to say human beings, and we're certainly being human, but we're far more than human. We're divine, eternal beings who are here having an experience, and we have no idea how powerful our thoughts, our actions, our words are. And a smile to a stranger on the street might save their life. And yet an evil thought about someone or unkind words could devastate their lives. We have no idea how powerful we are.
Hmm. It's a profound thought, to especially those of us that are struggling, because as powerful as love is, being able to serve somebody else, and we often think for years, and I still struggle with this, that I have to do something to serve them. But it's not necessarily doing something. It's really, like you said, a smile. It's changing the way I show up is doing something, which it's a little bit harder to grasp and hold on to, but it's as much as equally profound, I think.
Yeah. I mean, I mentioned I read things and they're totally different. I was reading the Beatitudes, after this, and there was the master, teaching the masses, and he said, "Be ye therefore perfect," which used to boy, that was a hard one. I'll never, and yet I realized he never said become. He never said become perfect. He said be perfect, even like that, even like your Father in heaven is. And I realized he was saying, embrace the perfection that you are. Consider the lilies of the field, how they grow. They don't spin and toil, and yet not one of them, is every one of them is greater than the greatest king you might know. I mean, these simple truths suddenly came with such clarity that it's like, wow, we are perfect. We're created in the image of everything that is perfect. And if we could embrace that in ourselves and in each other, without judgments and comparisons, the flowers, the lilies don't compare themselves to each other, and neither do we get to. We just get to love each other and point up and say, wow, isn't it a blessing and a gift to be in the body and be alive and be having my experience?
That's incredible. I'm curious. I know we touched on it a little bit, but your relationship with your oldest son. And I know you have two others. You've got 3 kids that you've been raising and connecting with. But you had quite an experience with your son, and he went through that accident and the loss of his mom. What was that like, and what's your relationship like today?
Well, we're very close. We're very close. I'm close to all my sons, and I don't even call my adopted sons my adopted boys. They're just my sons. But I've got a long answer. My answers are long to you have such profound questions. Spencer, when he was little. I mean, when I came home and I was still in a wheelchair, my left leg was cut off. I had no prosthetic at that point. So my left leg was cut off above the knee. My right leg was still sticking straight out in a splint because they had tried to rebuild that knee. My right arm was in a sling because they'd attempted to rebuild the shoulder. All I could do was drive an electric wheelchair with my one good left hand. And my brothers or somebody would have to lift me into the wheelchair. I couldn't transfer into a chair with no legs and one arm, right? When they finally brought me home, and I wasn't going to my home, I had to go to my brother's home, and I was there for home health, and they'd put a hospital bed in one of the rooms. And I mean, my recovery was much longer than the 5 months in the hospital, but I was so worried about Spencer. He was only 7. And as you pointed out, he had lost everything I had lost. He'd lost his mother, his brother. He'd lost his father in many ways. I was the rough and tumble dad, and here I was beyond crippled. I looked horrible. I had a big colostomy bag hanging off my belly. And I was going home to his turf, where, and I just thought, how's he ever going to accept me? And yet, as we arrived to my brother's house, there was Spencer looking out the window. He was watching as my brothers, his uncles, big, strong guys, lifted me up and put me in the wheelchair. And I thought, how's he going to deal with this? And anyway, he came running out of the house, and he ran toward me, and he ran right past me. And I thought, it's too much. He it's one thing when I'm under the covers in a hospital, but now that he's seeing all this exposed and it's too much. He ran right by me. Well, I navigated the wheelchair, and was beginning to turn so I could take it up the ramp. And I just looked over my shoulder to see where he was. And he'd actually run across the street, and he was knocking on all the neighbors' doors saying, come out, my dad has made it home. Come see my dad. And I thought, wow, my judgments of myself are not his judgments. And he did, after he knocked on there, he came and he threw himself on my lap, and he about killed me because I still had all the sutures from the abdominal repair. And he threw his arms around me, and, I was explaining, I'm going to try hard to get better. He was a Star Wars nut. And I'm like, they're going to get me a Darth Vader leg, and I'm going to work really hard to learn how to walk, but I'm going to be like this for a while. Are you going to be okay? And we still laugh. He said, Dad, if you were nothing but a puddle of blood, I would still love you. And I just burst into tears. But here's why I share that. I realized in that, here I was in a wheelchair, holding my surviving son, both of us brokenhearted. And it was no less divine than when I was in those other realms, holding my son who had passed in the arms of God. I mean, in the arms of a child. His unconditional love for me was as powerful as the unconditional love of a creator. And I realized heaven can be right here. There's nowhere to go. There's nothing to become. It's to be in that perfect moment and feel the unconditional love. And he was my hero through the younger years. Now, gosh, life went on. And I'll share this. It's a very long answer, like I say, but his journey. He never had a near-death experience. He wasn't held in the arms of God. He had lost his family. He had lost his father in many ways. And as he, started hitting 18, 19, he's like, Dad, I don't get it. You talk of these visitations. Mom came to you at the gravesite. You went to the other side. God held you and told you it was all okay. I got nothing. He's like, I was a little boy. I begged this thing you call God for 12 years just to let me feel my mom or see her once, and I got nothing. So it was a very poignant conversation. He's like, look, I'm done with all that. And he said, either you're deceived in some crazy way, or you're making it up and telling a lie. Or he said, if there's some greater power, it doesn't care about me, because I was a little boy screaming for help and I got nothing. I beat my knuckles bloody on that door and it never opened. And I was just like, I was gutted, I mean, I still pray. I went home that night and I prayed to God and said, I'll give it all away. You can take it. Just give him something. And it was interesting what happened, because as I'm saying, I'll give it away. I'll give away all my experiences for him to have some enlightenment. And I don't profess to talk to God every day, but I got a profound answer and was told, why are you judging your son? Judge not that you be not judged. Don't you know his experience is perfect for him? And why are you so arrogant to, assume that your experience is better than what he's experiencing? Your experience was perfect for you. His experience is perfect for him. Your job, Dad, is to love him unconditionally and stop putting conditions on his experience and love him. I mean, it's like the universe has been beating me over the head, with this unconditional love. And yet, long story short, he was in a rock band. Half the guys were going to jail. There was drugs involved, yada, yada, yada. And I'm saying to God, well, he might go to jail. And God said, perfect. Then that's his path for his soul's journey. And it was very poignant. And I'll wrap this up. But as this all unfolded, this is the kind of man that Spencer's grown into. Number one, yeah, there was some interesting things with the band, and one of the guys was going to jail, and there was a hearing, and Spencer said to me, I'm going to go to that hearing. I'm going to stand with my buddy. And I, as a father, I'm like, no, you're not. You're not going to go stand and associate with a known drug dealer, yada, 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 yada. And wow, he looked at me and said, is that how it is, Dad? Somebody messes up and you turn your back on them? Wow, that's not what you taught me. I'm going to go stand with my buddy because I might be the only guy that'll say, I love you. And you're going to get through it. And this is just a thing we're going to work through. And I thought, wow, wisdom. He's the wise soul. Spencer came to teach me. He came to walk with me through this journey, and he's become the most compassionate man I know. He works with young kids in little rock bands and teaches them music, and that's their therapy. He'll have 10-year-olds banging out Metallica, up on the stage. And he's like, Dad, that's their cry. That's their voice. That's their work they get to do. And he said, yeah, I've still never had that door open up there that you talk about. But he said, I've decided I'll be God's love. I'll be God's hands. I'll be God's light here. They can come to me and I can hold them and I can tell them and I can be there for them. And that's real. That's tangible and that works. And I just say, wow, he gets it. I'm learning. That's the story, in a nutshell, really, of what he's become and how his journey has led him to empathy and compassion and to being real in a way that people can embrace. It's tangible,
Fascinating. And I think it's interesting how many different layers, right, that you have to be reminded to quit judging and how many different ways we judge that somehow somebody's journey, because it's different in ours, that it's not what it should be or that it's not perfect for them. And we get all wrapped up. I got to fix this. Right. And it's just, and I'm reminding myself of, I need to step back a few times, right? I'm still jumping in there in places I don't belong.
Right. No, Spencer reminds me, I'll say, well, they should, and you should, and I should. And he'll say, Dad, quit shoulding all over everybody. Just leave it alone. I mean, he's a very wise soul, but yeah, it's a big lesson. And I've certainly learned it my way, but everybody gets to learn in their own way. Right.
Yeah. And we do it together. It's not meant to be done alone. Right. And we so often feel isolated and we're just not meant to do it alone. Yeah. Jeff, what an incredible story. I'm just thrilled to have, been able to spend this time with you and have you share that with our listeners. And the thing that I love so much is it's so profound that it changes the way I look at my life. I imagine it would change the way other people would look at theirs, or at least give an invitation to do that. So I love that. And if there's only one thing that people get out of your story is that love heals, and that if that's the only thing we give, that's the most powerful and most meaningful thing we can give. Yeah.
Yep. Love is the most powerful force in the universe. And yet we get to choose it, that free will and choice. We get to choose joy and choose forgiveness and choose connection and walk each other home, as they say. Even if we're going on completely different paths, we can still hold the context for each other in love to walk to the same great light, which is love in the end too. So, yep. Thank you.
Incredible. Yep. I sure appreciate it. This is, just totally moves me. So thank you so much. And I would love to be able to connect with you in the future, as things progress for you. And I'm sure your story will continue to grow and expand.
Oh, you're so kind. And you can find me, just Jeffery C. Olsen. I'm on social media, or you can send me an email at the same thing. Jeffery is Jeffery. C is my middle initial, and Olsen is Olsen.
And I'll also mention that your book, Knowing, is pretty profound, and you share in a very masterful way the experience and the emotions and how tangible that was for you. So I love that book and would certainly recommend that for anybody that wants to hear more of your story.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much.
You have an especially perceptive and spiritual kind of approach to all of this and a way of looking at it. Do you feel like you were that way before this incident happened? Have you always kind of been greater than average, emotionally intelligent?
I don't know, Kurt, because not really. I mean, I was a Division I athlete. I was a red personality. I was driven, go fight, win, get the grade, make the team, get the girl, get the house, get the job, whatever that looked like. And I suppose that is not a bad thing. I mean, that can be honorable, but it certainly softened me, and it certainly blew the doors open on a different way of knowing, a different way of seeing. I think I used to be judgmental even of myself. And what it did is just took judgment and comparison and moved it to a different space where it can be, learning and light and connection without the judgment. And that's brought me so much peace. It's so funny when you let go of judgment, how much peace can come into your life.
You shared your experience about going through the hospital and kind of knowing, and I think there's that like connection of knowing versus in that experience, do you feel like you knew things about those people beyond connection?
Oh yeah.
Do you feel like you knew intel, as it were?
Absolutely. I mean, I'll give one example. There was a nurse that passed by me, brushed by me, and they seemed to be completely unaware of me. But as she passed by, I knew everything about her. In fact, I experienced her emotions. I felt the abuse that she had received as a child, physical, emotional, sexual abuse. I felt it as if it was my own. And yet there was that's what connected us. And yet in that same instant, I saw what a magnificent soul she was. It's like, wow, here she is, serving in the hospital, healing others. And it was that profound, wow, is that what made her so glorious? Was actually the challenge of what she'd experienced, and that there was a knowing, and I did know things, but I'll caveat that with there was no judgment. There was only love and honor and glory. So I knew I was seeing them perhaps as God was seeing them. And then when I later had the experience in God's arms, I knew I was seeing them the way God had seen them. And that's when the knowing comes. And, people say, well, I know this and I know that. And very well we may, but it's one thing to have a theory or a philosophy or whatever, a belief, but when you know what you know based on experience, it's a different level of being. It's a different level of knowing, and that's where I try to live, is in that knowing rather than in a belief or a philosophy.
Yeah, I could see that would make some things a little bit harder, because in some ways you're more accountable that way now, right? That's you don't get the luxury of relaxed faith. You're stuck with a little bit more accountability. The thing that stuck out to me, a lot about your hospital experience, and I cannot remember the name of the book off the top of my head, but it's so similar to another account that I've read, and he shared the same experience of the levitating and kind of being able to see things, but knowing, okay, the doctor and the nurse that were working on him were having an affair.
Yeah.
Knowing additional information that, he really shouldn't have known.
Yeah.
And that next level, even also, like, I think he could pass through things as he was moving through the hospital. And as he passed through things, could know those things' history. Like he passed through a desk trying to get wherever he was headed, and he knew where that tree came from. He knew, some of those other things. So it's interesting to hear how kind of synonymous that encounter that you had was.
Yeah. There's many. I mean, there's so many out of body or near death experiences, and they're all unique and different. But there is the universal things seem to be the connectedness. I know the tree the desk came from, the oneness of all of it. The other one is often there are deceased ancestors or loved ones involved. And almost universally, there's this unconditional love, whether it's, whatever belief systems one might came from, or no belief system at all, they feel an overwhelming love and acceptance, which is pretty cool, I think.
I think
it's amazing.
Yeah, it makes everything go around. Do you get homesick?
Yes. I mean, quite honestly, it was difficult to be in this realm for almost a decade. I struggled. And, Tanya, my current wife, bless her, she put up with me while I tried to work through it. But yeah, I didn't want to be here. It's like, why don't I just go home? and still the self-doubt, like my son would be better off without me. I mean, my brothers would do a better job with him than I do. I mean, there's all these voices in our head, right, that tell us all these crazy things. Homesick. In fact, I've decided that much of depression, when people are like, I don't know why I feel this way, I think it's homesickness. I really do. I think they're homesick. We're in this crazy realm we call life, and it's like, where's all the love? Where's all the connection I once knew at home that I'm not experiencing here? And yeah, it's enough to make anyone homesick.
Interesting perspective. I know I've thought of it in my own life. I feel homesick, like I know there's this love that was out there, but I don't, it's not tangible, but I know it was. But then the purpose of why we're here comes back, and I can, come back and readjust and go at it. But you felt that certainly on a higher level than I think a lot of us do. So makes it maybe a little bit more of a longing.
We're wanderers in a strange land. And yet the beautiful thing, and this is what I really believe this is the game we're playing. Let's create heaven here. Rather than longing for what might be or what was experienced or what is, in my case, it's like, well, let's create it here. Let's create all that love and compassion and connection right here, right now. And then heaven becomes earth, and earth becomes heaven. It's all right here. And I often quote, Jesus or biblical things, and there's all kinds of different philosophies, but even in what we call the Lord's Prayer, he said, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven, literally calling it down, like, let's love each other here. Let's bring that unconditional love here and see what we can create as divine beings by simply choosing love over fear and judgment. Thank you, guys. And
thanks, Jeff. Appreciate it.
Thanks, guys. We'll see you.
Yeah.